Today we are welcoming a wonderful author from Lifestyle Publishing Portfolio. It's Dr. Gabija Toleikyte, the author of the book Why the Fuck Can't I Change? And you see here the Romanian translation, Fuck, de ce nu mă schimb? Welcome to Romania, even if only online.
Yeah, hi Regina. I have been to Romania actually, and I have a very good friend in Romania as well. So I'm familiar with the country a bit. Yeah.
Great. We are happy to hear that. So my first question, how was it for you to launch your book in such a special period like a pandemic?
Actually, to me personally, it worked out well, as I got my English-speaking country, UK, US, and Canada deal for just before the lockdowns started, and soon after international deals followed, and then which motivated me, of course, to just prioritize getting the book finished. And during the times of pandemic, for our family, actually, it did work well because we have now we have two little children. At that time, we had a toddler, and the pandemic and lockdown meant that none of us, my husband and my mom-in-law, couldn't go to their jobs. So, in fact, I had a lot of support with looking after our daughter, which meant I could spend a lot of time writing. And then, of course, when the interviews started, when we were about to launch the book, and when I was starting to be asked about writing articles and things like that to promote the book, I had plenty of time to do it, and also I didn't need to travel away from my family. So for me personally, it worked really, really well. I would say it was a perfect case scenario. Needless to say, of course, it was horrible what we had to go through, but for the book perspective, it worked well.
Yeah, and for the book, I think it was great. Romania received it very well. So we are happy to let you know that.
Yeah, perfect.
Could you tell us or give us an overview of what motivations means from a neurological perspective?
Yes, so motivation can mean quite a few different things. So in the brain, this is the brain, realistic size brain model. Deep inside, if you open deep inside there, in the what we call paleomammalian brain complex, there is a center called the reward center of the brain. And that center produces the chemical called dopamine. Dopamine is a substance which makes everything enjoyable. So if for one or another reason we can't produce dopamine, everything feels pointless. We can't get joy even, from the things we used to get joy from. What happens in clinical depression, for example, dopamine levels are low. So part of motivation is levels of dopamine rising when we do certain things or anticipate to do them. So such as, for example, if you anticipate to meet a friend of yours or to do the activity you really enjoy, your brain produces some dopamine to motivate you to do that activity. The more dopamine we get during the task, the more we will produce it, the more likely we are to do it again. And the more of that we'll produce it next time when we do it. So it becomes like positive vicious cycle. Now, there is another aspect of motivation called inspiration. Now, inspiration is much more higher cognitive function, which comes from the front of the brain called prefrontal cortex, just that. So inspiration comes when we do tasks that are really, really well aligned with who we are as individuals. And just to briefly mention, every single one of us have really unique brain, and therefore we have unique value hierarchy from the things we value most to the things we value least. And when we do the things that are at the top of the value hierarchy, of the true value hierarchy, not the one we think we ought to have, we feel inspired from within. We always find time, money, and energy for We can't stop thinking about it. We can't stop talking about it. And that comes from those centers at the front, which are crucial for personality, sense of self, and that kind of inspiration type of motivation.
Do you think we inherit our level of motivation? The genetics is involved in our
Partly,
level of motivation?
with everything, when we talk about the brain, with everything is nature and nurture, both. So the dopamine receptor genes and amount of dopamine produced, there is a genetic factor in it. And therefore, for example, in certain mental health illnesses, there is usually a genetic factor, because that determines how many brain chemicals will be created later on in life. But there is a very strong environmental factor as well, based on, of course, what activities you engaged in, what activities where you are rewarded for, and what activities you're punished for. So, and if you imagine, if you have somebody who naturally would have really high levels of dopamine genetically, so you would think that person would be really motivated, right? But this person, let's imagine it's somebody who loves to dance, just made something up. And if that child is constantly said, no, you can't dance, that's not a profession, you need to pursue completely different hobbies and focus on your studying, on whatever other aspects. And it's that crucial thing which would be inspiration for that child is taken away. And in a sense, the child is forced to become who she or he is not. Then naturally is pushed into the environment which is not that good for him. So sometimes lack of motivation is a feedback, whether in the right environment for you or not. So there is a very strong aspect of, from childhood onwards, what activities you are allowed and not allowed to do, but also what environment you eventually end up in. And the same person in one career could be extremely motivated and inspired from within, while in other career procrastinate, get depressed, eat on sugary snacks, and be constantly preoccupied with other things.
You said about the procrastination. How we can overcome it? Does the Pomodoro technique functions here?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, as with everything in my book, I talk about, firstly, we need to look into the mechanisms. Why do we procrastinate in the first place? What is it, in other words, that you're getting out of procrastination? And in the book, in the chapter on productivity, I talk about 6 different types of procrastinators based on what needs they're meeting with a procrastination. So let's take somebody who is what we call them, like really active person and loves change, and it gets really easily bored. We call them sometimes ADHD-like people, but they don't necessarily need to have ADHD as the clinical diagnosis, but they hate doing the same task for long periods of time. They love change. And you give them a task such as writing PhD thesis, as it was my task I procrastinated over. And that's a task which is not very aligned with that neurotype, if you like. So naturally, that person will procrastinate doing that task because it requires sitting for a long period of time in order to complete it. And procrastination then meets the need of variety and change. Now let's take another person who is very anxious and perfectionistic. That person wants to get everything done so perfect because, in fact, maybe since childhood, he or she was punished of doing things not perfectly and have really, really high standards to themselves, almost unrealistic standards. Now, they might procrastinate because they are so afraid to let go the product which might not be 100% perfect. So they might keep on writing, rewriting, deleting, and eventually decide, you know what, I'm just going to delete it altogether. So procrastination there might be coming from fear. So it almost like meets the need of safety, because if I don't let go of this product, at least nobody will know that I'm not good enough. Okay, so these are just two examples, but there is many more. So firstly, in order to change that procrastination, we need to figure out what's the cause of it, and then to work out how can I meet that need in more constructive ways. So for example, that ADHD-like person might need to really make that writing PhD thesis much, much more playful. So writing for 15 minutes, and then taking a break, doing something else, and then again writing for 15 minutes. Or also applying Pomodoro technique works really well for those ADHD-like brains. Now, somebody who is perfectionist and are really afraid of letting go of the task which is not 100% in their minds correct, might work having a mentor who will reassure them what standard is sufficient, what standard is required, because they are their own worst enemy in self-judgment. So there is, again, solution on procrastination depends on the cause.
Yeah. I was wondering if religion, which is an important part of our contemporary lives, does it impact our motivation?
It can be part of, when we talked about inspiration, what things really inspire you. And for some people, the religion and values of religion, if it's really well aligned with the individual values, it can be very inspiring activity. Some people choose not to call it religiousness, but like to call it spirituality or soul pursuits. And that could be very strong motivation, as spirituality is all about growth and developing and being your best self. So it can actually really help people to overcome hardships and see the meaning in difficulties. Also, sometimes from a religion point of view, sometimes having a sense of belonging, sense of community can work really, really well in being in a good emotional state. But again, it only works if it's well aligned with who you are as a person. If your religion or your chosen spirituality field is at odds with who you are and you feel like you need to change yourself to fit that religion, then it won't really work to make you inspired in your pursuits.
Well, so I found in the book very interesting idea, the 50 reasons for change. Why should I do a certain change in my life? Please tell us more about it.
Well, whenever we talk and think about creating a change, we naturally think of it as, I'm going to miss out on something. So, for example, I talk in the book about me giving up pastries and sugary snacks. And my immediate reaction was, I'm not going to be able to eat like croissants and candies and have the like donut with coffee or whatever, you name it. I love those things, right? They are really, really delicious to me. And I have really, really a sweet tooth. Now, of course, if I associate it with negative or pain centers in the brain, I'm very unlikely to do it. If I, instead of that, if I say, okay, well, that's all true, of course I'll miss it, but there is lots of benefits of doing that as well. First of all, I will probably feel healthier in myself. Secondly, I probably will lose the excess fat layer. Thirdly, I'll probably have much more energy and wouldn't have that, sugar rush and then sugar crash. So I probably wouldn't need to keep on drinking that much coffee to stay awake. As a result, not drinking as much coffee, I probably would get less migraines and so on. So thinking of all the benefits of that, changing that habit, would naturally help me to change my perception. And instead of associating change with the pain centers, I associate with the reward centers, which will be releasing the chemical we spoke about, dopamine. The more dopamine you can release regarding the change, the more likely you are to both start this change, but also continue. Repetition only comes if there is enough motivation in the form of dopamine to do it.
The concept in your book can be applied to self, to work, to relationships, to social lives. How did you apply them in your own life?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we apply the concepts of amygdala hijack and the brain energy management in my relationship with my husband all the time. And in fact, it helped us to overcome through some, I wouldn't call it conflict, but friction. So for example, my husband works really, really hard. He's a chiropractor and comes back home exhausted. Now I miss him, right? And I want to spend time with him and hear all about his day. Now, knowing that his prefrontal cortex is done, it doesn't get energy at the moment. He needs to eat and relax first. I postpone asking him questions and give him dinner, give him time to chill and do whatever he wants to do. And after an hour or so, he comes to me and starts telling me all about his day, right? The same happens if there is any point of disagreement. So for example, my husband loves mountaineering, and it triggers fear in me because I'm of course afraid to lose my husband and the father of our children. And whenever he says, oh, I wish I could go and do these routes in the mountains, it overwhelms me sometimes because, of course, he still does mountaineering and skiing, but much safer routes than he used to do, as unfortunately a lot of his friends have died in the mountains. So whenever he talks about the mountaineering, if I get that anxiety, I share with him, because when I talk about it and say, look, it's all great that you're dreaming about it, but do you really want to do those things? He's like, oh no, I'm just talking about it. I was like, and I share with him what emotions it creates in me. And then he thinks usually twice before, just making those spontaneous, I wish I could remarks, unless he really wants to do it. If he says like, you know what, I really want to go to the Alps to go ski touring this winter, sorry. So of course, if that's something he intends to do, we talk it through, and it's worthwhile eliciting that so-called amygdala hijack. Or else it's actually, he tends not to mention so much. So that's just one of examples of how we apply it.
I know you are also a performance coach. What is the first question you ask someone as a performance coach?
When I start working with somebody, we do the exercise so-called the wheel of life. So we assess how well the person is doing in each area of life. They might come to me because of the career. They say, oh, I'm really stuck in my career. I don't enjoy it anymore and don't know what to do about it anymore. They might be struggling with a relationship or parenting or mental health. But we assess whole life, all the areas of life. And I share in the book that exercise, how you can do it yourself, is rather simple exercise. But that helps me to see the big picture view, because everything is connected. And I notice when we work on one area with my clients, other areas improve as well. So first thing is really getting big picture and not getting zoomed in too soon into one little problem, because they might say, oh, my life is absolutely horrible. I can't seem to be able to do anything right. But when we assess it, they are like, oh, actually, it's only my financial situation is horrible. The rest of it is really, really good. Or, so it helps them to really see it for themselves. What's the more objective view of it?
I read that your next book will be on neurodiversity.
Yes, that's.
Could you tell us a bit about it?
It's a little bit early phase. I'm still researching and thinking about what specifically to include in that book. But I can tell you of the reasons I want to write about neurodiversity. In quite a few interviews I was giving about my first book, interviewers or attendees of the seminars kept asking me, okay, that's all great, but I have ADHD, or I tend to get so depressed that I really struggle to get out of bed in the mornings. Would those tips apply for me as well? And the short answer is yes. Long answer is it depends. We need to, for more neurodiverse people, such as ADHD, OCD, autism, Asperger's, and so on, a couple extra steps are required before they can use the insights from this first book. And first step is actually really understanding what's unique about their brain. what specifically about the brain is different from so-called neurotypical brains. And then secondly is constructing a niche. So niche construction for neurodiversity is one of the most important things. Instead of trying to become what we call normal or neurotypical, embracing, I'm not neurotypical, and those tips that work for neurotypical people will just kind of lead me astray from my own path. So therefore, I need to work with my brain as it is, as opposed to try to change my brain into what's not. So in that book, I'll discuss all of that. And, that would be like beforehand steps, so the neurodiverse people could then later on take the biggest advantage of my first book as well. However, some people said that they still, even though they were neurodiverse, they could still get loads of insights from the first book as well.
Yeah. And my last question, I'm sure maybe that pandemic changed of all of us. Do you think we changed at a profound level, neurologically maybe?
That's a very good question. And unfortunately, there is no way of truly knowing. We can speculate. In the department where I lecture, Sheffield Hallam University, we have Applied Psychology and Behavioral Science Center where they do research, and part of research is on the psychology of the COVID pandemic. And they're looking into, what are the lasting changes to do with it. Just some speculations are that depends on what you experienced during those couple years of pandemic, that of course inevitably has a trace on your brain. For some people who are coming back to neurodiverse people who prefer being on their own and like working remotely from their own house, pandemic actually created positive emotions. And they could finally do things in the way that works for them. And that in particular works for Asperger's and autistic, but also for people who have social phobias and are more introverted, because they no longer needed to get distracted and have so much effort just wasted to manage that extra stress. For other people who are more health conscious, a pandemic might have elicited a huge amount of anxiety and stress, or people who have loved ones who are in really vulnerable groups. Unfortunately, I know one of my close friends and a few people I know lost their loved ones due to COVID. So that can elicit very, very strong anxiety, and that can overwhelm amygdala. Once amygdala is overwhelmed, we are much more likely to fall into the depression and other mental health conditions. Now, in terms of the lasting brain rewiring, it all depends how it later on continues and what we as individuals choose to do. Now, if individuals who developed health phobias during the pandemic, which in fact it seems to be rather common thing to develop, choose not to leave their house anymore and just stay in the house, unfortunately that will keep on changing the brain more and more, and it will become harder and harder to leave the house, as each time even just the thought of leaving the house would cause lots of anxiety. Now, feeling the emotion and saying, okay, actually it is safe to leave my house if I take all the precautions, and if I make sure I protect myself in the right way. Now, the more times they leave that house in that way, the more they would change all the patterns they built during the pandemic, and they would get less and less anxiety each and every time. But it has to be small steps at a time. So I would encourage everyone to ask yourself, how did my brain change during the pandemic? What happened? Did I become more anxious? Did I physically change and became less fit? Because that also requires brain to get into the habits of exercising and doing all the health-related habits. Did I become more introverted than I was? And so on. And then ask, what's the one little step I could take in order to get back to myself? who I truly think I am or who I was before. Because if you think that during pandemic you became more of yourself, who you are, then that's not the problem, of course. But if you think I kind of became what some people even say, the shadow of myself, or, you know, covered with all these extra layers, such as phobias, anxieties, and bad habits, then ask what's the one little step and apply this step as often as you can. So if for you is like leaving the house for 10 minutes, leave the house for 10 minutes every other day. Okay? And then increase that to 15 minutes. And so on, and build it gradually. And in general, any habits, and especially after when it's to do with anxiety and emotions that are fear-related, amygdala-related, small steps are crucial. We cannot just jump and say, you know what, that's it, I'm going to live as I lived before. That wouldn't work.
Gabija Toleikyte, thank you very much. Maybe when the all this madness will pass, maybe you can visit your Romanian readers and see your friends in Romania.
Yeah, why not? Why not, hopefully.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and I wish all the Romanian readers very well-functioning and well-replenished prefrontal cortex and calm amygdala and courage to really explore the neuroscience of your brain and taking, you know, practical steps to make your brain function better, small steps at a time. Thank you.